So on behalf of the owners of Politics and Prose and our dynamic booksellers, we'd like to welcome you here to a book launch party for Wonderland. Tonight's event marks something like a sort of homecoming for our guest author. Stephen Johnson grew up around here in Bethesda, Glen Echo area, and went to St. Albans. He currently lectures widely on technological, scientific, and cultural issues, both to corporate and education institutions. Newsweek named Stephen Johnson one of the 50 people who matter most on the internet. In addition to being a tech icon, Stephen Johnson is also a best-selling author of 4 books on the intersection of science, technology, and personal experience. His new book, Wonderland, builds on the premises of his past research of the effects of junk culture on the brain, as featured in his book, Everything Bad is Good for You, and Errors of Invention, as illuminated in How We Got to Now, 6 innovations that made the modern world. Merging these facets of luxury and invention, Johnson surmises in Wonderland that play is the thing in regard to catalyzing innovation and indicating future markets of technology. Virginia Heffernan praises Johnson in her New York Times review, asserting that Wonderland makes a swashbuckling argument for the centrality of recreation to all of human history. The book is a house of wonders itself. That's some praise, right? I myself share that praise for Wonderland, as I was amused and informed by Johnson's claims of how candlelight illusions of 17th century phantasmagoria gave rise to industries of television and cinema, and how cylinders of musical boxes, looms, and moving dolls gave rise to computers and artificial intelligence. Here to bring us into Wonderland is our majestic author, Stephen Johnson. Thank you.
All right. Hey, so there's some seats up here. If people want to come up now, this is a great time. There's at least 7 or 8. They seem to be kind of barricaded into this little square here, so you may have to climb over the books. But come on down if you want to get a seat there. Can everybody hear me? Is this good? Okay. Thank you for that great introduction. I should clarify 2 things. The first is, it is true that Newsweek magazine did call me one of the 50 most important people on the internet. However, that was in 1995, when technically there were only 50 people on the internet. So it seems a little less impressive, you know that. And actually, I don't mean to brag, but this is my 10th book, book number 10. And I believe that I have come to Politics and Prose for every single one of them. Certainly the last 9. I'm not sure if I came here. My parents are here. One parent is there, and the other parent is over there. They're often together, but right now they're apart. And so it's so great to be back. Real hometown. Got a lot of faces that I know. Thank you for coming out. This is such a great institution here. So I'm honored to be back. And so I want to talk a little bit about this new book. I'm very proud of this book. It is, I just should say at the outset, it's the most lovely physical object of any of my books. It's got this beautiful cover, and if you see inside, it has lovely full color illustrations and beautiful stock. And the words are fine too, they're good. But as an object, it's really great, and thus makes a beautiful holiday present for the historian in your life. So this is a book, in a way it's a book that is a sequel of sorts to How We Got to Now, the book and the PBS show we did a couple years ago. And we are, for those of you interested, we're very hopeful that we will do another season of How We Got to Now based on a lot of the material in this book. We're still working on that, but hopefully that will happen. But unlike How We Got to Now, this book has a kind of a macro argument about a neglected force that has shaped the march of progress. It's shaped large changes in society, and that force is the power of delight and of amusement and of play. When we think about the kind of prime movers of history that you were taught in high school or in college, if you kind of list off the things that naturally come to mind, you think, okay, the quest for power or national or tribal identity, or just the desire to stay alive and feed your children, or religious beliefs, or the desire to accumulate wealth, right? Those are some of the kind of prime movers of history that we conventionally roll off when we think about what drives historical change. But I try to make the argument in this book that there is something else that is neglected, in part because we often divide up all the things that we do in the name of fun or delight or amusement into different categories, and we don't kind of lump them all together. But if you look at all of these things, basically all of these things that we did, not because we had to do them, but because it was enjoyable to do them, because it was fun. There was no survival value in doing these things, but they were just interesting and delightful. That body of work and of innovation turns out to be a big driver of historical change in serious history, as well as in the kind of the history of just messing around and having fun. And I'll give you some examples of it. But it was interesting. I was last week I was on tour on the West Coast, and I gave a talk at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And before the talk, I had a meeting with a brilliant evolutionary psychologist whose work I've followed for years, named John Tooby. Some of you may know his work. And we were talking about this phenomenon, and I was asking him, what other species show our capacity for kind of delight and amusement and wonder? And he said, well, it's interesting, that we've tracked chimps in the wild will go out of their way on a kind of 30-minute walk that they're clearly like deliberately taking, following a path that they know through the jungle, to arrive at a waterfall where they will just sit and look at the waterfall for an hour. So somewhere in the chimp's mind there is a thought of, well, I've got some spare time. I guess I could go look at that waterfall that's so pretty. And there's nothing functional about it. There's no real direct kind of survival value in this action. There's just something delightful about sitting by a waterfall and watching it. And so we see that kind of behavior in particularly our near relatives like chimps, and in general there seems to be some direct correlation between the overall intelligence of a species and its ability to delight in things just for the amusement or the play of it all. But humans are obviously far more advanced at this, and really than any other species. And of course, because we have such extraordinary powers of technological ingenuity, we have gotten better and better at constructing a world designed specifically to delight us in all these extraordinary ways. Just the expansion of spaces and of technologies designed to trigger moments of kind of wonder and surprise and amusement is really an extraordinary part of the last 1,000 years of human history. But it goes back, tens of thousands of years, to early jewelry, to musical instruments, things that have no real functional value, but that somehow intoxicate our eyes or our ears. And the argument of the book is that those pursuits actually end up triggering much more momentous changes in society and politics and in business and in science than you would expect, given their kind of seemingly frivolous roots. So I'll give you just a couple of examples to give you a taste of the many stories that are in the book. The book actually starts in Baghdad over 1,000 years ago, at the height of the Islamic Golden Age, which is a good place to start because one of the big themes of the book is how much the pursuit of delight has driven the kind of world economy and driven the forces of globalization. People seeking out new experiences that originate somewhere else in the world because they're interesting and surprising, and they end up kind of bringing the world together. And in Baghdad, about 1,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that, there was a marvelous institution which had a great name called the House of Wisdom. And the House of Wisdom was, in kind of today's parlance, it was kind of a think tank and a translation bureau and a maker lab, I guess we would say now. It was a place filled with all these engineers who were doing really extraordinary work, designing extremely advanced, some of the most advanced engineering the world had ever seen at that point. And three of them were these brothers, they're now known as the Banu Musa. And they published a couple of extraordinary books with titles like The Book of Ingenious Devices and things like that. And they're actually reproduced in beautiful full-color images in Wonderland. And they have these gorgeous kind of schematics where they show these contraptions that they've designed, and they have these really advanced hydraulic systems and incredibly accurate clocks, much more advanced engineering than anything that Europe would see for another 500 or 600 years. But what's so interesting is you flip through this book and look at the things they're designing. They are all toys. They are all little automated dolls, basically designed to amuse and delight. There's an elephant that is also a clock, and there's a little animated peacock that dispenses a little bit of soap, and a little man who pops up on the hour like a cuckoo clock. So they're all really indistinguishable from child's playthings, but they contain the seeds of ideas that would go on to revolutionize kind of traditional serious engineering 500 years later, 600 years later. And one of the creations that the brothers designed that's actually not in the main book, and it was almost lost to history until a manuscript was discovered about 100 years ago in Syria. And it includes these schematics for a device they called the instrument that plays itself. And the instrument was basically an automated flute player that was actually playing a little organ kind of behind the scenes. And what made this device so interesting was that it had a device very similar to a music box, where there was a pin cylinder, as they call it, where it's a rotating cylinder with little metal pins on it. And the pins corresponded to the notes you wanted this automated flute player to play. And so as it would rotate, the flute player would play and you would hear a different melody. But what made this so radical was you could swap out this cylinder. If you wanted the machine to play a different set of tunes, you could take out the cylinder, rewrite it to they would actually call it cutting a new cylinder, much like people would later talk about cutting a record. And you could create a new set of codes instructing the machine to play a different set of melodies, and then put it back in and the machine would play this new melody. And this was an extraordinary breakthrough because it really was the first programmable machine. It was the first time people began to think about a machine that would have this kind of abstract set of skills, and if you wanted it to do something different, you could just recode it. So in a sense, the beginning of the division between hardware and software comes out of this automated flute player for the first time. This idea of programmability, which is one of the most important ideas of modern computers. And what's fascinating about programmability is that it stays in music for 500 or 600 years in the form of these music boxes that had swappable pin cylinders, and music boxes begin to proliferate through Europe, and they're kind of a little toy of the aristocracy and the elite in the 1600s and the early 1700s, and the kind of automata creators who built these beautiful lifelike mini kind of robots in the 1700s in London and in Paris used that same pin cylinder approach that the Baghdad brothers had pioneered, until in the middle of the 1700s, where a wonderful, brilliant French engineer named Jacques de Vaucanson had built an automated flute player very similar to what the Baghdad brothers had done. And he also had created something you may have heard of called the Defecating Duck, which was an automated duck that was so accurate that you could feed it food and it would defecate. So that's what they were doing for fun in France in 1740. But Vaucanson came up with this idea, said, well, listen, if you could create a machine that could be programmed to play different patterns of music, different patterns of sound, why couldn't you take that same idea and create a loom that could be programmed to weave different patterns in fabric out of threads? And so he built this programmable loom, really the first programmable loom ever built, using these same big metal pin cylinders. But it didn't work very well because the cylinders were very expensive and difficult to kind of reprogram and replace. And they were very repetitive because once you did one rotation, the pattern had to repeat itself. So it wasn't as good for kind of interesting design. And so the idea kind of stuck there for about 50 years until another French engineer, more famous now, named Jacquard, came up with the idea of replacing the pin cylinder with paper punched cards. Little holes in paper that corresponded to different threads being activated in this device. And that became the Jacquard loom, which was really truly the first working programmable loom that really took off, revolutionized textile production, and also influenced Charles Babbage, who invented a few years later the first programmable computer, the analytical engine, which was programmed with punch cards that he had specifically learned about from the work of Jacquard. So when you ask yourself the question, where did programmable computers come from? where did we originally get this idea? The conventional answer is, well, we got it from kind of the military, right? They started developing computers in the 1940s and the 1950s to crack wartime codes and to calculate rocket trajectories and things like that, all of which is absolutely true. It is an important part of the story. But computers also came from automated flute players and mechanical devices and music boxes and people being delighted by patterns in fabric. Those stories are just as important to answering the question of how people got to this radical transformation. Obviously, one of the most important innovations, the programmable computer of the last century. And right around that time, related to this theme of kind of fabric, in the 1680s, if you'd walked around the streets of London during that period, you would have seen this very interesting new phenomenon that had developed, which is a set of beautifully designed, elaborately decorated stores selling fabrics, selling furniture, selling dresses and other garments. And these were really interesting stores just in terms of their interior design, because up until that point, most stores were very functional. You would either, you would have a little stall, or you would have a really bare-bones store. People would go in and they would, more or less barter for their goods. And it was a very functional exchange. There were arcades that had started to develop a little bit before this time, but again, each salesperson was just in a small little shell and they had their goods right there and they would sell directly to the customer. But these new stores were, in a sense, a kind of envelope of luxury and refinement. They looked like someone's drawing room in an aristocratic home. And well-to-do women in London, starting in around the 1680s, 1690s, began to go to these stores and began to kind of spend an afternoon going from fancy store to fancy store. And it was the birth of the idea of shopping as a recreational pursuit. Shopping, in a sense, as an end in and of itself, right? That it was nice to get the dress, but it was also nice to just hang out in the store because the store was really nice, right? Today, we accept this. We understand that retail environments, from shopping malls to the Apple store, are designed to be wonderful, delightful spaces where you just go to hang out even if you don't want to buy anything. At the time, this was baffling to a lot of people. And there are a number of commentators, mostly men actually at the time, who wrote very puzzled pieces, including Daniel Defoe wrote a number of things about this, where they were just baffled by what these tradesmen were doing, wasting all this money on their decor. And he was like, why wouldn't you just sell your goods in the most efficient way possible? Why would you spend all this money having these beautiful glass windows and having these beautiful, curtains and a faux fireplace and all these things? And he couldn't understand it because he was looking at it entirely in this kind of efficiency model. But the delight, the kind of the wonderland of the space itself, of the commercial space, the retail space, was something that these new shoppers were starting to realize was really interesting and really fun. And what they were experiencing in those stores in 1680 and 1690, more than anything else, was an extraordinary, delightful new fabric from the other side of the world, which was calico and chintz, cotton that had been created and then dyed with this inventive new, not new in terms of Indian times, but new in terms of Europeans, dyeing technique that created these vivid patterns that wouldn't go away after you washed them multiple times. This was one of the big innovations of calico and chintz that the Indian dyers had hit upon a couple centuries before. So you had these beautiful patterns, and they were made of cotton, and cotton was just this revelation. Suddenly you had this very soft fabric with beautiful colors. And it was important in part because up until that point, people would wear underwear that was entirely made of wool. So you can imagine London, rainy, cold London, wearing wool underwear, and all of a sudden cotton comes along and has, in addition to the underwear, it has just amazing colors and these delightful patterns. And so people go crazy for calico and chintz. And this leads to, first off, a huge booming business for the East India Company. Vast fortunes are made, a whole shifting relationship, the beginnings of British imperialism in India. It leads to a massive trade imbalance with India, and it devastates the traditional English wool economy. And so you have all these weavers and wool producers in northern England who are basically being driven out of business by these fashionable women shopping for Indian fabrics. And a massive patriotic political backlash erupts against these women in particular, kind of publicly shaming them. They were called calico madams. And something about their kind of sensual interest in this exotic new fabric was destroying England as we knew it. And so this what you could call a kind of make England's wool industry great again movement starts to appear for understandable reasons. And there are hundreds of pamphlets written and plays and poems. I quote a bunch of them in the book. At no point in human history have women's undergarments provoked so much patriotic fury. That's one thing you can say for sure about this. And for a bit of time, calico and chintz are actually banned from England because it's devastating the economy. But of course, at the same time, another group of people, entrepreneurs and engineers, are starting to think, well, wait a second, what if we could actually use some of these new technologies, potentially powered by steam engines, to manufacture fabrics like calico and chintz here? That would be pretty interesting. And that, of course, is the birth of the Industrial Revolution. So the question is, when you ask yourself, what were the prime movers that drove industrialization? Arguably, with the digital revolution, the two most important technological revolutions of the last 1,000 years, arguably all of human history. What were the prime movers? What started the process? The traditional way you hear about it is that a bunch of very clever engineers began coming up with these new technologies, and they set off this economic revolution. And eventually people got wealthy enough that a upper middle class consumer society developed after all that wealth had been created through industrialization, and people started having department stores in the 19th century and things like that. But in fact, it has it the wrong way around. It started with this moment of kind of delight and magic with this new fabric from somewhere across the world. And that interest in that new fabric then triggered a set of events that eventually led to industrialization with all of its positive and negative consequences. I mean, one of the things that I try and stress a lot in this book is, while this is an upbeat story about delight and wonder on some level, and it's a celebration of those parts of what it means to be human, it is also a story of tremendous exploitation and human suffering, right? You cannot tell the story of the appetite for cotton without talking about the history of American slavery, right? If those women had not developed that taste for those fine fabrics, it's entirely possible the whole history of slavery in the South might have been written differently, because the dependence on the cotton crop was so central to prolonging slavery as long as we did. So it's certainly part of that story. You can make the argument that all the way up until about 1860 or so, cotton was arguably the worst thing that had ever happened to the world at that point, or that happened to the world during those 200 years. So when those women were trying on those fabrics for the first time, they had no idea they were also going to unleash this long arc of exploitation and human suffering. But that is part of the story as well. So momentous changes come out of seemingly frivolous beginnings or idle pursuits. I'll take just one other theme, and then we can open it up for questions or conversation. And this really comes in the last chapter of the book, which is about public spaces, kind of like those stores, that are designed specifically for leisure and pleasure and amusement. Just think of the proliferation of environments, of built environments that are designed for your pleasure and amusement, from parks and zoos to amusement parks to movie theaters to bookstore events. I mean, there's just an incredible proliferation of spaces designed to delight us in one form or another. Compared to 200 years ago or 300 years ago, it's one of the most remarkable changes in the kind of built environment that human beings live in, is all these wonderlands of delight and amusement. And one of the things I try to talk about in the book, and this is something that comes up in How We Got to Now as well, is when we talk about innovations, we talk about new ideas that change the world, we tend to focus on these kind of technological breakthroughs where it's like someone invents air conditioning or somebody invents the iPod and the world changes. But sometimes just ideas on their own, or ways of reimagining existing things with kind of new metaphors, that too can become a kind of innovation that changes society in powerful ways. And one of those is the kind of refashioning or reimagining of what nature was, that happened in the late 1700s and early 1800s. It's funny looking back on this, but until that period, raw, kind of unstructured nature was largely seen as a threat, the thing you avoided, the thing you either plowed or ran into the cities to escape. The nature was the thing that would kill you if you were left in it, right? This is the way Europeans viewed nature at this point. And there's a great, hilarious literature of people particularly were offended by and just terrified of mountains. And mountain landscapes were considered just abhorrent scenes. So people, riding their carriages past the Alps would ask to actually be blindfolded so they wouldn't be exposed to these monstrosities off in the distance. And so nature was not the idea of going and kind of contemplating nature, of losing oneself in nature, of seeing nature as a space to enjoy and kind of delight in, was really not a common idea. And starting in the late 1700s, advanced in many ways by the Romantics, by both poets and by painters, but a new notion of the natural space began to develop, that this was something that one could enjoy, that one could savor, and that perhaps should even be carved out and protected in some fashion. And one of the things that developed, which I love, is people would go to nature with a little device called the Claud Glass. And the Claud Glass was basically just a little mirror that you would pop up, but it was deliberately kind of distorted. It had all these little etchings in the mirror so that if you looked through it, it made everything look a little bit like an oil painting, like the little kind of cracks of an oil painting that is dried. And what people would do is they would go, to the Alps somewhere, and the big vista would be there, and they would look at it through this little glass, and it would look like an oil painting of the Matterhorn or whatever it is they were looking at, and they would be like, "Oh, that's so beautiful." And so it was basically an Instagram filter, many years before the technology after arrived. But it was a way of kind of turning this natural space into this sublime aesthetic experience for the first time. And that, of course, led to the formation of two really important wonderland spaces of modern life: national parks, beginning with things like Yellowstone and Yosemite. Now there are national parks all over the world, but also urban parks, the public spaces of great urban parks. There had been urban parks before, but in many cases they were dedicated only to the aristocracy or the royalty. They were private grounds. But in the 19th century, you see these really epic new kinds of recreation spaces designed for everyone, designed for a city to share in kind of collectively. And that is one of those places where you can go today and really see the continued legacy of this kind of delight and wonder and connectedness, the kind of the story of globalization that things like cotton and calico and those Baghdad automatons and spices, which I have another chapter on, that global connectedness that delight helped to create. If you go to a great urban park, we live most of the year in Brooklyn, right near Prospect Park in Brooklyn, the other great Olmsted Park in New York, and go there on a summer weekend day, and you will see every culture in the world hanging out in this space, happily, grilling hot dogs, listening to music, tossing a Frisbee around, getting along, at play, at ease with each other. And it's something worth reminding, because that kind of environment, a play space where all the world comes together and everyone more or less gets along, is an incredible rarity in the long arc of human history, right? There are plenty of cases of small insular communities where everybody knows everybody and everybody's half related to everybody and they get along in a kind of small town environment. That is as old as human settlements itself. But the idea of a great city and a great public urban park with that kind of diversity, with everyone hanging out in a space designed specifically to facilitate that relaxation and that amusement, that is a great achievement. That is an innovation that deserves to be at the top of the charts with the iPhone and the internet. And in fact, I was thinking about it as I had that conversation with John Tooby at Santa Barbara, because in Prospect Park, there's an old growth forest that we would sometimes walk into, and there's a little waterfall in that forest, and it is a sad little waterfall. I can tell you that. Having been to Yosemite, seen some of the waterfalls there, it's maybe about 5 feet high. It's clearly not natural. It may be some kind of sewage runoff. I'm not sure what the water is actually coming from. But when our kids were young, we would go and make a little pilgrimage through the woods to see this waterfall, like the little chimps our children were at that age. And they would sit there at 4 or 5 years old and look at it. There was nothing functional about it at all, it was just an interesting thing. They happened to live in an environment where waterfalls were scarce. And so seeing one was just a moment of kind of delight and surprise. And you could see them being captivated by it, as pathetic as it was. And that side of us, that capacity to be amazed and amused and to pass that amazement and wonder on to our kids is such an important part of who we are as a species, and what we've done as a culture in expanding that. Not just our biological roots and capacity to be amazed, but all the things we've devised to extend that amazement. And maybe now more than ever, it's a good time to remind ourselves of that side, that connective, open-minded, open to new experiences, open to surprise and wonder. That is still part of who we are, and there's still more opportunity to develop it further. So Wonderland is my little attempt to advance that argument and remind ourselves of how important that is to who we are. So I hope you get a chance to read it. Thank you very much. I have no idea how long I just spoke, but we have definitely some time for questions. So if people want, there's a mic there, and there's a mic there. So please approach the mic, or I will tell other stories about my children if someone doesn't come up.
Let me ask you a question.
Okay, great.
We had talked about. Well, thank you so much for your work. I love how it talks about how desire is a prelude for innovation. So you had mentioned, before you went out that there's a lot of correlations between Wonderland and the HBO show Westworld.
Right.
Would you be so kind as to share that with the audience?
Yeah, sure. Westworld, starring another St. Albans graduate, Jeffrey Wright, one of the great actors of his generation, who was not interested in theater at all at St. Albans, I would like to add. I was the big actor back then, but apparently he had the talent. So how many people have seen Westworld? Yeah, so it's kind of, they're hoping, the new Game of Thrones, and it just wrapped up. And I'm just going to give away all the exciting thing that happened in the last episode on Sunday. No, I'm not going to do that. No spoiler alerts. But it was weird. It's a show about a kind of a theme park that is populated in the future by these robots that are so lifelike that they really feel like they're human, and it's kind of like a Disney World, except that the Pirates of the Caribbean can walk up to you and talk to you and interact with you, and you feel like you're talking to a human. And what basically happens, and I won't say anything more, is that they get so human-like they start to become self-aware and realize that they're just trapped in this weird kind of narrative cage, and hilarity ensues. No, it's not funny at all. It's very dark, actually, in many ways. But there are all these themes, actually, that even in the opening credits sequence, there's a lot about automatons in here. There's obviously a lot about amusement. There's a lot about Disney in this book, reigniting obsessions with Disney that I had when I was 9. And even the whole opening sequence has this elaborate thing about player pianos, and there's a big riff about player pianos in Wonderland, because player pianos are the first technology that involves encoding some form of entertainment, in this case into a paper roll with kind of punch card like information, that you would purchase, bring into your house, plug it into your device. The device would decode that information and entertain you with some kind of, in this case, music. That's something now we take for granted, that you would get a CD-ROM or a CD or a DVD or download something, and there's a machine that will decode that information and then amuse you and delight you. Player pianos were really the first kind of model of that to come into the household, now ubiquitous. And so right at the beginning of Wonderland, of Westworld, there are these player pianos and these automatons. So we're very in sync, and if 1/1,000,000th of the audience of Westworld will purchase my book, I'll be in good shape. Yeah.
I was thinking about sports a lot,
yeah.
And certainly as a recovering football fan, I think a lot about the University of Alabama and how George Wallace stood so adamantly against integration of the University of Alabama. But they're the best football team in the country because of the participation of African Americans. And I'm wondering if in your book you have much to say about sports and the way that all of our certainly racial struggles, but other struggles too, take place. Feminist struggles take place in terms of sports.
Yeah, it's a terrific question, and you just made me feel really guilty about the relative lack of sports stories in the book.
I didn't mean to.
No. There's a chapter on games, and there is a section on the history of the ball. The ball has this very interesting history. When Columbus first goes to America, I think on the second trip, he's on the beach in modern day Haiti, and his men see these indigenous folks there playing this ball game, and they're like, what is up with that ball? It is so bouncy. And they can't figure it out. And what they're seeing for the first time is first Europeans ever to see rubber. And the kind of Central American and South American, a number of different cultures had basically figured out a kind of a low-tech way to vulcanize rubber, and they'd made these bouncy balls for 1,000 years. And the idea of rubber, which of course then becomes in the 19th century a massive, center of industry, gets smuggled back into Europe and circulates through Europe entirely for 200 years as bouncy balls. Like, people are just like, this is so cool. I have no idea what this is going to be good for, but it's amazing. And just look at that. And so there's a kind of material science history of the ball that's in the book, but there's your point about the history of sports and, let's say, civil rights as part of it is such a good one. And I should actually add, I'll add it to the paperback, but one of the common themes is in a lot of these play spaces is that they are, in the long run, they are democratizing and integrationist in their tendencies. So whether it's sports or bars, for instance, the history of taverns. Taverns historically have been places where classes or ethnic groups that historically weren't, or had no other space where they could mingle and form friendships, where there were kind of subcultural spaces where people could go and have a drink, and you start to see this kind of blurring of class boundaries, of ethnic boundaries. Think of the importance of bars in the history of gay rights. Right, Stonewall, the Black Cat, almost all of these momentous moments in the gay rights movement involve a tavern or a bar somewhere. And so a lot of these spaces where people go to have fun and to relax end up creating exchanges between people who in the rest of their lives are being kind of kept separate or thinking kind of negative thoughts about each other. So there is a history of play there that involves precisely those ideas, just not enough in this book about sports. But I'll get to it, I promise. Yeah.
Okay, first, it's not a question. I just want to echo something you said earlier, and thank you and your publisher for stepping up the quality of paper, because some of those reproductions are amazing.
Good. Thank you.
As far as the question goes, you talk about the public space and delight and people entertaining themselves as a group out in the public space. How do you get, you probably don't get into it as much in this book, but maybe it's in a future book. Yep. And that is what video games and computer games are going to do to the social aspect of delight and fun.
Yeah, great question. Well, I do talk about it a little bit. In fact, video games, there's an amazing long history in the history of serious computing and software design and interface design that was advanced by people playing games, which is a separate point, I know, but there's a bunch about video games there. It's and I wrote about this a little bit as we heard earlier in my book Everything Bad Is Good for You, which was in many ways a defense of video games, kind of that I wrote 10 or 11 years ago when my children were much younger. Now that they're teenagers, I renounce everything I wrote. We burned all the copies in my house, and they'll never find out what Dad used to think. But there are two sides to it. The first is some of these, and I think about this a lot as a parent, some of these games are really extraordinary wonderlands themselves, right? Where they're very rich environments. You think about something like Minecraft that the kids play, where they're building an entire world. It's not just it's Minecraft is like, the magic that a kid feels going to Disney World, except that you could design your own Disney World and then share it with your friends and walk around that Disney World together, having designed it together, and come up with all these ingenious experiences. So it is happening on a screen because you're inventing a world. It kind of has to happen on a screen, but it's incredibly creative and imaginative and celebrating. So in our household, we have a big division between games that make you think, that are not educational games. They're fun games. They're not designed to teach you something. but they make you think. They foster imagination, and games that are a little bit more kind of mindless that we try and discourage somewhat effectively. But what's starting to happen, and this is another case where what people are doing for fun now actually anticipates kind of serious changes in society, is emerging of games and real spaces. That's what happened with Pokemon Go this last summer. Is suddenly you had a video game that you could not play unless you were out in the world. And actually, they designed it specifically so you would go to public spaces. They built public landmarks were an important part of the kind of destination for people to play Pokemon Go. And we felt it. We live in California in the summer. We live on a little hill, and there's a lovely, beautiful walk by the bay going down from our house down to the little town. And we're always trying to get our kids to walk up and down this hill, and they never do it. And then this summer they were playing Pokemon Go, and they were begging us to walk up and down that hill. They would just be like, "We're going to go to town. See you later. We have to catch some imaginary monsters on our phones." And they got way more exercise. So on the other hand, they were walking around kind of looking at a screen, but they were out and they were engaging with things. So I think, there is a sense in which certainly our children have a default setting of we would like to stay at home and look at the screen and interact with this world. And that default setting needs to be overridden some of the time. It's too heavy an enticement. But there's creativity happening on the screen, and there's also creativity in creating screen spaces that take people outside and engage in the world too. Yeah.
Thanks for your great books.
Thanks.
When you were talking about Baghdad earlier, I was thinking kind of Joy Ito and kind of reigniting the Media Lab and MIT and things like that. And I was wondering what you thought about kind of universities as a safe space for play and exploration.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, Joey has a new book out yesterday, I think, called Whiplash. Just came out, and I was hoping to. They have so many similar themes. We may do something together. I was just emailing with him. I do a lot of talks at colleges. My books. One of the nice things about my books that has happened in the last 5 or 10 years is a lot of schools are starting to adopt them as a freshman read, where the whole incoming freshman class reads a book and then they all kind of discuss it the first week of school, and then I often come and give a talk. One of them is my book, The Ghost Map, about the cholera outbreak in London. That is often used for that. And these poor kids are like on summer vacation, and they're like, why are they making me read a book about intestinal disease? I don't understand. What college am I going to here? But anyway, one of the things that I say to them, these 18-year-olds, talking to 3,000 18-year-olds in a basketball gym, is that the kind of the intellectual play space of a liberal arts education, I certainly remember it as one of the great periods of my life. And what it gives you, what I try and say to them is like everything after you leave your college years, every major force in society is going to be trying to get you to specialize and to focus on something and become an expert in one field and, get good at this thing that will become your vocation. And that's great. We need experts and we need focus and all that stuff. But of all the people that I've studied in my research on innovation over the years, one of the things that unites them all is just this really eclectic interest in lots of things and an ability to make connections between different fields and to see a link between chemistry and politics or between electricity and games or computation or whatever it is. And so the great opportunity, the play, I think, of university space is that ability to kind of dabble in lots of different things and to have that sense of, well, I may fail at this, I may not be good at this, but I'm going to try it. And also to have the opportunity to make connections conceptually between, you go to your physics class and then you go to your history class and then you start thinking like, well, what can physics actually tell me about historical changes, right? Because they are absolutely connected to each other. The flows of energy and maximizing and making energy transmitted and utilized more efficiently is one of the prime movers of history, along with delight and fun. So I think creating environments where people are encouraged to make those kinds of connections, that's one of the things that I think schools should be doing as much as possible. Thank you. Yeah.
How do you think that schools and educators can kind of use this desire for delight with students in terms of especially motivation for the younger levels and students who find themselves quite behind?
Yeah. So it's funny. We used to say, my parents will remember this, that the thing I really wanted for my kids was that they be obsessive about things, that they would get really into something and just want to know everything they can about it. And because I was like that as a kid, I got really into dice baseball games, and then I got really into magic, and then I got really into Disney, and I got really into all these things, and I would learn everything I could about it. And none of those things, well, till now, I guess, none of those things were actually really useful to me when I became a grown-up and actually went out to try and, make a living doing something. But the feeling of mentally just getting incredibly infectiously curious about something, that's what I do all the time now as a grown-up. That's what motivates me in writing these books and gets me up in the morning. And so I would say, I don't care what my kids are into, as long as they're obsessively into it. And that's what I really want for my kids. And then my kids grew up a little bit, and that actually happened, but what they were into was luxury yachts. Then I was like, anything but that is stupid. They'd be like, why don't we have this $30 million yacht, Dad? I'd be like, that's the stupidest thing I've ever seen. That's a stupid obsession. Mine were much more reasonable. So careful what you wish for. So figuring out mechanisms to do that. And one of the things also in the case of education, I'm really interested in, I'm trying to write something about this actually in the next couple of weeks, hopefully. But game mechanisms, not kind of gamification where it's like there's a score and you have to win. That stuff is a little bit sinister, I think, sometimes. But game design as a conceptual exercise, as a cognitive exercise, is really a powerful thing. So when you ask, and this can be board games. It doesn't have to be programming. It doesn't have to be in fact, sometimes it's better as board games. But let's say you're teaching a class about the history of the spice trade or something like that, and then you challenge the class. Okay, come up with a game, given what we did in the reading, that reproduces some of the issues or the tensions of the spice trade. And the exercise of designing a game, I was doing this for fun with my then 8-year-old. We designed a little board game a year and a half ago, and it's a really rich way of thinking because you sit there and you're like, all right, I think this should be the theme of the game. These should, you can play with 3 players. These are the rules. The chance mechanism is cards or dice or whatever. This is what the board looks like. And I think given all these factors that the game will be really interesting and fun. And then you play it. And it's terrible. It's so boring, or you win in 3 turns, or you can't win, or something, people get stuck in one corner of the board and they can't get out. Something you didn't anticipate, or 1,000 things you didn't anticipate. And then you revise it and you're like, okay, how can we fix this? And so what they're doing in that exercise is the scientific method. They've got a complex multivariable system. They're building a hypothesis about how that system might work. They're then playing it out in an experiment and then revising their hypothesis based on that. And kids will do that all day long if you present it in the form of a game. So it's a really fun thing to do, just if you're not an educator, just with your kids. And now they have these sites where they will if you make a board game, they'll actually turn it into a proper game, and it's like the self-publishing site. So they'll publish the game for you, and you can sell it. And so I was doing this with my 8-year-old, and the older boys were like, all right, well, listen, we get 10% of the profits because we contributed a few things to it. So it's a big battle about if we ended up making a fortune, what we're going to do with it. So, yeah.
So on the topic of education, I'm here with a few colleagues from Kaboom, which is a national nonprofit that's dedicated to play. So we think a lot about play spaces built specifically for children. What can you tell us about the kind of interplay between a recreational place for adults and places that we actually build for kids?
Well, I think you probably, you know more about this than I do. I think that it's a big, there's a great thing that Stuart Brand said to me, the founder of the Whole Earth Catalog and author of many great books in the Long Now Foundation, and he's in this because he wrote a very famous essay about Space War, an early video game. But I was talking to him we were talking about play and kids, and he said, the thing that's amazing about children is until institutions develop to get them to stop thinking this way, kids obviously love to play, but one of the things that is essential to their definition of play is inventing the rules of the game they're playing. And then as they get older, Little League officials show up and say, no, the game has to be played this way, and this is the way Abner Doubleday designed it, and this, you can't win. But up until that point, the natural attitude of a kid is to play is to invent the rules of what you're playing. And spaces that are, I think, somehow designed to create interesting, open-ended kind of rule spaces. So in Brooklyn, there's a public school down the street from us that has an open playground that we go down to, and there's a weird elevated area with a wall on two sides and a little cage around an air conditioning unit coming out of the school, and then a railing, and then a drop of about 10 feet, whatever. And we went over there, and the two of the boys, and I mean, we invented a game, bouncing the ball. It's kind of a racquetball-like game, except you're playing with the soccer ball and kicking. And we've slowly been refining the rules to this game now, and it's become this kind of magical thing. It's really like one of our major sports now in our family. We call it 321 ball because it's PS 321 where we play, and it's a really interesting combination of we do serious things with our kids, by the way, too. I just want to make it clear, like we help them with homework and stuff like that as well. But it's this weird hybrid of our imagination and the specific design of this weird corner of the school, and the two kind of within these constraints. What kind of game could we invent? So to me, like the idea, the Kaboom idea that we need to have the importance of those kinds of spaces, and that we need to celebrate those kinds of spaces, and being a kid can't just be about sitting at a desk and memorizing things. It has to be about that, but also thinking about the design of those spaces so that they encourage that kind of inventing of a new game, inventing of a new rule, because they're weird and funky in some kind of way. That is part of the magic of, I think, being a kid, and spaces that are designed well, I think, can really bring that magic to life. But I'd love to talk more about Kaboom. That's great. Okay, do we go to the signing session now? Yes. Okay, I think we're out of questions. I've answered every single one of your questions. It's amazing. I've never done that before. Thank you all so much for coming out. It's so great. Thanks a lot.